Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre.
I think the government has changed its role over the years in terms of infrastructure development. It has, I would say, today it's more an enabler in this space. It plays multi-level roles in sort of multiple sectors. It has also transformed, like sort of growing up from adolescence to adulthood. It has also transformed itself over the years into what it wants to do and where it wants to be a player, where it wants to take risk.
You just heard Prashant Sabeshan, lawyer and author of Investing in India's Infrastructure and Energy Sectors, responding on the changing role of the government at the state and national levels in infrastructure development. He goes on to elucidate further in this conversation with urbanist and policy researcher Dr. Champaka Rajagopal, while they touch upon a wide range of points within the vast umbrella of infrastructure development, including specific and generic legal issues that arise in certain core sectors. Over to Champaka.
Thank you, Lekha. Welcome, Prashant. I remember the first time meeting you at your office a couple of years ago while I was still working on my doctoral dissertation. And you had mentioned at that time that your book on laws and practice in infrastructure development was underway. And it's absolutely fantastic to circle back after all these years and to have this conversation with you on your book. We've shared so many common questions on the contentions in infrastructure development in India. So really looking forward to this chat with you.
Yeah, thank you, Champaka.
One of the areas of interest I recall we both discussed and we've harbored over the years is about the enormous presence of the private sector in infrastructure development and the role of the government in providing concessions to the private sector, right? While there are several other more pressing societal issues. So I'm curious, right at the beginning of our conversation, to have a sense from you on what the role of the government is today at the national as well as the state levels in infrastructure development. Have the governments receded or have they become more aggressively involved in societal commitments?
So, as you pointed out, yes, it's been a while for the book to come into sort of play. So it's taken a couple of years, and even in that period of time, I think the government has changed its role over the years in terms of infrastructure development. It has, I would say, today it's more an enabler in this space. It plays multi-level roles in sort of multiple sectors. It has also transformed, like sort of growing up from adolescence to adulthood. It has also transformed itself over the years into what it wants to do and where it wants to be a player, where it wants to take risk, where it doesn't want to take risk. And also, what it has done is also given the federal structure, there is both, I would say, a tug of war, between center and state in many cases of infrastructure development where states compete, with each other to attract investors and good players in this sector. So the government enabled a number of developments, and I would say that today, it is sort of more an enabler and an implementation authority, rather than somebody who does everything all the time, and rather than an executing authority. So I think that is a shift which has taken place.
Very much so. There's such great levels of competition and the competitive states at the state government levels that have evolved over the last 20 to 25 years, clearly, and also over the last 2 decades. Both parties, the public as well as private, has evolved, isn't it? Would you say that this sort of a transition that has taken place over the last 2 decades and more, would you feel it's a radical transformation or it's a gradual process of change? In other words, we know that public-private partnerships have become the norm now for infrastructure development, for instance. So have public and private organizations, would you see them as unlikely partners? For instance, the government is committed to meeting its public purpose goals while the private firm is driven by profit making as a sole motivation, right? So are they unlikely partners that are coming together? In what ways have these two parties really come together to work with one another for infrastructure development in public interest? What are the transformations that have taken place in both these spaces, both the state government as well as the private sector?
The way I look at it is that, initially maybe 20 years back when we started this journey, public and private were very far apart. Public had its own goals. Primarily, there were socialist goals with some, economic content thrown in. And the private sector, like you mentioned, were, primarily more focused on economic and business goals. I think over a period of time, I would say that the government has become more private in its thinking. The government needs to think more like the private sector when it's implementing these projects. For example, in the airport sector, it is very common for government to be a shareholder in airports, private airport development, and in return, it gives land as against equity. There are instances where the government themselves have stepped into forming companies, where there is a commercial interest involved. To give you an idea, long back in 2003, 2004, in the state of Gujarat, the Gujarat government decided to step into the oil and gas sector and formed a company called GSPC to sort of say that there is a potential in this area. Today the GSPC group is about 15-20 companies, and it is all government owned and purely run on a commercial basis. You take the recent instance of the Amravati capital, which was proposed to be built in Andhra Pradesh. There the government through an SPV was planning to take almost nearly 42% equity in the company. I mean, almost close to majority. And the government is also saying that if I want to help in infrastructure development, I also want the upside in this development. I'm not going to just sit back, just give you the concession, be an implementing authority, sign forms, receive reports, and sort of go home. I want to be a lot more involved in this development. If there is private sector interest, then I want to also make money. And I think that has sort of changed in terms of government transformation and government thinking. And at the same time, I would say that private sector has also given India's long history of public sector interest and public sector challenges. Private sector has also started taking into account very seriously public interest which is involved in projects. So in a way, private sector also has sort of become more public. They realize that yes, there is money to be made in these projects, but they have to same time meet the public interest test. Projects have to have a public element. And remember, in this area, always one of the counterparties will be the government. So slowly that transformation has happened, and I would say rightfully so, where government has also realized that there is economic interest involved in these projects. It is a willing participant. Of course, the degree of risk that it manages is different in different projects, but it has slowly also, I would say, started thinking and wearing its private sector hat when it is sort of getting into infrastructure development.
That's very interesting. You say that the roles of both parties are not as clear anymore when the two institutions are sort of partnering with one another, right? Like the public sector partnering with the private sector. Public sector is thinking entrepreneurially and the private sector is thinking public interest. So it's very interesting to see that there are these blurred boundaries that have emerged over the last so many years of partnerships between these two parties. And I think the other important aspect you mentioned is about risk, that the government is aware that there are multiple risks here and that the partnership model between public and private entities has been conceptualized in order to ensure that the risks are borne by the party best capable of handling these risks. And typically, the government's perspective is that they can hand over these risks to the private sector. And in my own practice and research on PPPs and transport infrastructure, I've also seen that the government plays a host of roles, facing multiple dilemmas at all points in time. Governments are obligated to cater to multiple competing demands at the same time, right? While facing resource crunch of all sorts. So they've found the need for partnerships with private sector agencies necessary in that sense, perhaps. And reflecting on my own engagement with government at the national and state levels also over the last decade, I couldn't agree more with you when you say that the government has acquired a great level of acumen to manage the private sector smartly in order to meet its own growth and public purpose goals. And yet at the same time, as you rightly mentioned, Prashant, much of the infrastructure development that has taken place is ridden with so many forms of risks, right? I recall in 2016, newspapers were flooded with articles on how the banks were sparring with the National Highways Authority of India for defaults on loan repayments. And many companies filed for insolvency and bankruptcy soon after. Banks had filed for bankruptcy as well. Time and again, multiple governments have waived corporate loans amounting to more than thousands of crores each time. So if the NHAI, for example, or corresponding state level agencies such as the Public Works Department have not prevented these financial risks, then hasn't the government failed in its role of preventing or addressing these risks well enough? How have these projects fared across these sectors, airports, highways, ports, railways? Your insights on these would be great to have, because markets in these sectors also vary in their scale. For example, the airports and port sectors require much greater technological advancement than the highways. They require much larger capital investment as well. So your insights on these would be fantastic to have.
My understanding is government has slowly realized, when it started off in this journey, it said, I want to do everything, I want control, and the way of exercising, control was control of asset, control of, economic rights, control of tariff policies, control of contracts. This is the way government exercised control, what we call lock-ins, promoter controls. Over a period of time, government has realized that even without exercising controls over assets, over projects, they can get the work done and make money. So I think government, if you take, I'll give you a few examples where government is very selectively choosing risk and managing risk. So as we discussed, one is say the airports example where, government says that I will give you land, I will take up equity, and I don't want any performance, construction or operation risk. That is, one example of, say, government purely takes equity risk, takes the equity upside if the project makes money, and it gives land. Of course, the land comes at a, price or is part of a concession. But there is no further sort of capital investment or sort of capex which comes from the government. The second sort of example, is at the same time, this is in the bigger airports. But if you take the tier 2, tier 3 cities, government has said that nearly 100 or 120 airports are going to come up in the next 8-10 years in India. And there the government is willing to spend money, willing to use taxpayer money, engage contractors and build these airports. Because they realize that the airports are still not ripe enough for private sector to come in and manage that risk. So therefore the risk taking ability or aspect of government is a lot more, in that aspect. Now similarly, if you look at the recent example where 6 airports, which were granted out by the government to the Adanis, what they did there was a different type of risk, saying that we will build the airport, but the private sector will come and maintain and operate the airports for me. So the way they managed risk was that again, it was essentially like a private sector operator, managing that airport for them. So they took up the construction risk, they developed the airports to the point where the private sector got interested and then will come and bid for those projects. An example where today in many sectors like electricity sector, where government has completely come out of running projects, even distribution sector has been privatized in a few states. Government is also saying that in other states they're going to privatize distribution. You look at what they are doing recently with say their whole ability to, they want to divest Air India, they want to divest Bharat Petroleum, even looking at LIC. But I'm primarily, what are they doing? They are saying that yes, we will manage the risk up to a point. We understand these companies have to operate and be profitable, but they also realize that stepping out is not a bad thing. They also need to time the stepping out, and there is money to be made. There could be investors who could come and bring in technology and capital to grow that project, and therefore they are willing to step out. But at the same time, in certain sectors, the government says that I will continue to be there. To give you an example, we had the story of Konkan Railway, where the government said I will not give it to private sector. It was an extremely difficult, complicated, first public sector sort of railway corporation, an engineering marvel, and the government said I will do it. Similarly, if you look at the central government and state governments have formed a joint venture for railways development, cargo development, station development, where the government says that I will develop it jointly with state governments. So I will take that risk. I may let private sector come and run it, but in terms of development and construction, I will still control it. So another instance, you take oil security, where the ONGCs and the IOCs of the world, they are from an energy security point of view. The government is very much managing and undertaking that risk in foreign countries in sort of very great measures without letting it go to the private sector. So I think the government understands very well now, over a sort of journey of 20 years, that risk is different, risk taking ability is different, and they are willing to say that in certain cases I will take risk, and in certain cases I will not take risk, but I will price that risk which the private sector will come and pay me for, and accordingly manage that risk. So I think they are very cleverly doing that in various sectors. Of course, there are different formulas they are using for different sectors, but I think in terms of just understanding risk, I think they understand risk better now. They understand risk taking better now. They also understand where they want to stop and let the private sector come in and take over.
That's very interesting to learn, Prashant. Basically, what I understand is that the government across sectors is very strategically making decisions on where they want to take risk, where they want to address risks, and where they would like to back off and not actually enter partnerships in greater depth, and then rather hand over the risk onto the private sector. And the way in which they are doing this is also through bundling and unbundling of concession agreements, which were previously conceptualized as very long-term contracts, which included multiple stages in the project cycle, right? So they had of course, the first stage is the procurement stage, but subsequently there's the construction approvals, then there are a host of other components in the concession agreement, which includes both the operations and maintenance component as well. But what I hear from you is that the government is deciding to unbundle the concession agreement involving construction from the subsequent component, which is more the operations and maintenance component. So these are one of the ways in which the government explores risk management. But one of the key issues that this discussion brings us to is public-private partnerships are essentially structured on long-term contracts. This structure itself causes much risk at the implementation stage. I've studied long-term PPP contracts in the transport sector as incomplete contracts. And the problem here is that neither party is able to foresee the exact nature of the future. And so they're not able to stipulate specific conditions in the contract itself. So uncertainty and risks ensuing from this uncertainty are inevitable in long-term contracts. Then is the long-term incomplete contract the origin of these legal and financial risks? Is that how you would see it as well?
So yes and no to some extent. See, one thing was very clear that, after 1991, when India went through the stages of privatization, there was private capital needed in these sectors. There was no way the government could fund everything what was required for the country, and there was no way public money could chase these projects. So private investment was required, and at that point of time, the only way to attract private investment was to have contracts which get the private sector comfortable. And what did these contracts do? These contracts said that you have a period of time to construct this particular infrastructure project. You have to bid for it, and after that there was a period of time given to make money. That money was essentially in the form of some cash flows, where in some cases it was a toll, some cases it was a tariff. You had in some cases the ability to set tariffs. Sometimes in some cases there was a sort of a ceiling, in some sectors like the port sector. If you take the electricity sector, you had the ability, a little more freedom to set tariffs. So what the government did was to say that, in my understanding, that the government said that, look, if it costs some X for you, in terms of building this project, and then you need a certain rate of return, a certain economic interest on these projects, everything put together, I believe that you will make money in XYZ years of time, and we will structure the contracts on that basis, and that is how the concept of long-term contracts came into force. And the private sector was very happy because here was an assured contract where they had a concession for a long period of time, they could make money for a long period of time, and the financiers are very happy because in turn they could fund projects, earn interest for a long period of time. So I think that was sort of the beginnings of a long-term concession of of these long-term contracts. Now, over a period of time, both the authority and the bidders realized that social and economic dynamics have changed. If you take, maybe there were many road projects where the number of the traffic figures were not sufficient to take care of the cash flows. You take the infamous Dabhol project where the tariff found was so high that it was just unaffordable, and they were ended up with payment defaults. You take a number of even today electricity privatization initiatives where a number of discoms are in defaults, in terms of making payments under these long-term contracts. So over a period of time, what the government realized is that the contracts have to be, yes, they are long-term, but the terms of that contracts also have to be something which can be alive, which can be dynamic, and which take into account social and economic realities, which sort of will happen, as part of this journey, as part of this project. And what I think they did after that was essentially introduce the concept of some level of dynamism in these contracts in terms of contract review clauses, change in law clauses, tariff review clauses, and from a purely a legal point of view, there are concerns that this reopens the contract. But at the same time, I believe that these were all necessary evils which help contracts become more dynamic, because what we are doing is each time we revisit tariffs, we revisit the contract after a period of every 2 or 3 or 4 years, we have to justify some of the contract fundamentals at that point of time, and that helps in sort of bringing out the realities of that contract. And remember, also the government hands were tied because there were a number of sort of public committees which mentioned that if you sort of make these contracts too flexible, the private sector may not come, and therefore the contracts, long-term contracts, were sort of undertaken in a very rigid framework. But over a period of time, they have realized that yes, some level of flexibility has to be there. And if you take what the government did was they said yes, one, we have to have flexibility, but two, the important step the government did was also to encourage regulation and regulators in these sectors, which will take an independent view of these contracts as and when they come up for review. And this was a very important, I would say, a quasi-judicial or sort of a democratic function which the government instituted over a period of time, saying that unless we had independent regulators who undertake this tariff, or contract review function, the private sector is not going to believe, in fairness and transparency. And that is how the concept of regulation worked in the developed markets, which was introduced. So today you have, any PPA which you have, comes up for tariff review, every year or 2 years. You have, the airport sector comes up for review before the ERA every tariff cycle period. Similarly, you have other sectors where there is an independent tariff review, which is done, or a contract review which is done. And on one hand, while we can argue that this sort of takes away the fundamental crux of contracts being sacrosanct, but at the same time, on the other hand, it made sure that these contracts are stay in public limelight. They are relevant for the public. They take into account tariffs. And I'll give you an example. When this journey of privatization in renewable energy started, there were something called feed-in tariffs, which were almost about 9 or 10 rupees per unit. Over a period of time today, those tariffs have reduced to less than 2 rupees a unit. And there are a number of government companies who have signed these contracts who are now questioning the long-term contracts, saying that this is not in public interest. Even if there is no clause, I need to reopen this contract because I cannot be wasting public money paying 10 rupees when the cost of that contract is just 1 or 2 rupees. This is there in, as recently as this year, the Andhra government cancelled a number of PPAs, the Punjab government cancelled a number of PPAs. So what is happening? I think that there is public awareness The government is also equally aware. And end of the day, whilst we may say that this opens up contracts, but at the same time we cannot ignore the element of public interest in these contracts. So in a sense, I would say that long term, yes, but not too long term is the goal. There has to be some definition of, I personally believe that today 20, 30, 40-year contracts are just too long term. You should have much shorter sort of long term contracts of 7, 8 years, because things change, economics change. The private sector has already made its money, and if you want to attract maybe a new set of bidders, maybe you would want to rebid that project after 8, 10 years, and today you don't have the ability to do that in long-term contracts. So I think the concept of long-term contracts has changed. There is now a recognition that it has to be more dynamic. Contract review, tariff review is not considered incorrect. It is considered part and parcel of these contracts. So I would say these are 3-4 sort of learnings which have happened in this space.
Thanks, Prashant. Those are very important insights. I have one specific question on the relationship between contracts and many of these new regulatory institutions which are governing these transport sectors, right? Like you mentioned, the Airports Economic Regulatory Authority, the AERA, for instance, is an independent regulator for the airport sector. So what is the relationship between these new regulatory institutions and how they shape the rigidity or the flexibility levels of contracts, and how do they then produce or mitigate or prevent risks? That's one thought that comes to my mind. And another is that, are these risk-laden dynamics more prevalent in the sectors which are not governed by independent regulatory authorities? The AERA, for example, is known to usher efficiency to projects and confidence amongst private investors. But the parallel issue and the more important core issue is that these independent regulators are not governed through democratic oversight in their day-to-day operations. Moreover, PPP projects themselves are governed as special purpose vehicles, as you rightly mentioned as well. So these are companies run by boards of directors where there are no elected representatives involved. So how should we view these new forms of governance, considering that more than 60% of all infrastructure projects being planned in the country today are envisaged as public-private partnerships?
My response is that today, actions of regulators are subject to determination by courts. And let's understand that, if you take a sector where there is no regulator, there was only, say, the private party, the successful private party, and there was the authority. And nobody really knew what was going on in that contract. Once that contract was bid out, it was continuing for the next 30, 40 years. Today, a regulatory process, we may not say that they are fully independent. We may say they need to be more independent and dynamic and robust. But end of the day, a regulatory process is still a public process. It is in public eye. Just to give you an idea, let's see, if you look at how an electricity tariff process works. Every year, the procurement tariffs, there is a public notice issued. There are number of, anybody can participate in that public process, saying that there is a proposal which is received by, say, one of the procurement companies. The regulator invites the public to participate. There is a consultation process. As recently as sort of yesterday, in Karnataka, for example, BESCOM went through this public tariff process and had asked for a tariff freeze of about 1 rupee 35 paise per unit. But through this process, the regulator said, no, I feel that you're only entitled to 30 paise per unit. Similarly, if you look at the AERA process, at that point in time, public sector, private sector interest, there is a consultative process when it's setting the tariff. So slowly but steadily, one is, I think, regulatory process is becoming more transparent. Today, most of the tariff orders which are passed are on websites. You can go to any of these websites. You go to the AERA website, go to any ERC website. You will find these tariff orders, and they have to give reasoned judgments for these tariff orders. They have to explain why they are doing that. Today, equally, they are subject to the scrutiny of courts. And I think what government in a way has also said that, look, I am mature enough to realize that my actions will be subject to court scrutiny. I don't mind standing before a court of law and justifying my actions as to why I did this and why I did that. And we have seen that time and again in so many decisions where government has is not afraid to go to court, as part of a public consultation process. And today, government has said, let there be transparency in tendering. There is an e-tendering process. The government has said that, I am not scared of a review process. Just like anybody else, I will participate in that review process, and my reasons are equally subject to challenge like any other person's reasons. So I think that maturity has come into government, that by being transparent, I'm only sort of justifying and strengthening my case. I am helping in this whole efficiency and accountability process. The government, both at the center and state level, we have number of situations where of course the ERCs, both at center and state level, they are willing to subject themselves to a court process and stand before courts and justify their decision. So yes, regulation can improve, but we should also recognize that independent regulators have come a long way. They have explored new avenues of transparency in many sectors. They have come out with a number of reasons and judgments for arriving or reopening contracts. And all this, I think, is a part of a very healthy consultative process involving both the public sector as well as the private sector.
Thanks, Prashant. Those are great insights again, especially because there are two perspectives, I believe, on the levels of readiness of the government, on their willingness to be subject to scrutiny. On the one hand, there are perspectives that scrutiny itself makes governments risk averse. But what I'm hearing from you is that governments have become much more prepared to actually be subject to scrutiny, which is a very interesting insight to hear.
I'll give you a recent example. When there was a foreign investor who was looking to set up a large land-based project near Bangalore, and he wanted a number of concessions which were which would have been extremely beneficial for him. There was a very large investment which was being planned, and when he met the state government officials here, they patiently heard him out, but they told him very clearly that, look, we appreciate your investment, but we cannot do anything which the law or policy does not permit us to do, because one is we are answerable to the public, and two is our actions are subject to scrutiny tomorrow before courts, and we are accountable. The government, especially state governments, would have hesitated to do this maybe 8-10 years back. But today, what I find is there is a sea change in their thinking also, that they also need to be accountable and they are part of a public transparency process.
So, Prashant, it's intriguing that you say that the government has become much more prepared to face scrutiny of courts. But my contention is that many of these moments of scrutiny itself are pointing towards a certain set of anomalies, right, in the process. Why is it that we see ever so many types of disputes between public and private sector agencies and all of these public-private partnership-based projects? I've also come across many cases in the roads and highways sector, for example, where government, the granting agency, which is typically the National Highways Authority of India, for instance, is quite risk averse. They're not necessarily as prepared as your insights are telling us. So if projects are so laden with risks, whether it's litigation risks, it is project delays, cost escalations, and all of this then are risks that are finally transferred perhaps onto the public sector and onto the taxpayer. So if these tenuous dynamics are endemic to privatization, then why privatize? Could you share your insights on these, please?
See, the fact remains that these risks are inherent in every infrastructure project, but at the same time, the fact remains that government cannot do everything. They need private sector to come and participate in this risk. And there are concerns, and like you rightly said, that the number of these projects go through litigation. There are a number of disputes. There is land acquisition is a big problem in these projects. Private sector constantly feels that there is sort of inflated costs. Things could have been done faster. There are various funding challenges. There is not enough money available in the sector to fund these projects. In many cases, the government prices these projects also incorrectly, saying that there has to be a minimum revenue share or a minimum say a traffic amount which the government has to recover minimum toll which the government has to recover. Most of these projects says that you cannot there has to be a minimum amount of say threshold value which government has to recover. So I think the fact is that these are risks which are there in this project, but the government at the same time is not going to be able to do everything and manage these risks, and it is best left to the private sector to manage these risks. And what the government has done instead is try and strengthen some of these, say, the litigation aspects or the land acquisition aspects which they have done. In many cases, if you look at even towards they are sort of in court, they have new arbitration mechanisms, they have introduced a new land acquisition and compensation act legislation. But the fact is that these risks are not going to go away in any project. There is always going to be litigation risk, there is always going to be performance risk, getting the project completed on time. And that over a period of time, the government has learnt that in a number of projects and implemented it in sort of subsequent tenders and RFPs. But at the same time, just because a project carries risk with it doesn't mean that the government has to always end up managing that risk and undertaking that risk. So I think the government has in a way, in its own way, smartly decided that what I'll do is transfer risk to the private sector. I will try and make it a little more convenient and sort of make it more comfortable for the private sector to come and manage its risks. I will also set up, say, a transparent process and maybe a court process or a tribunal process where the private sector can go and argue its points in a transparent manner. But at the same time, just because of these difficulties, I am not willing to step in and take that risk. And I think that is a fair manner or an approach, I would say, because end of the day, the government can only do that much with public money. The government will have to ensure that private sector manages this risk. The private sector has to manage whatever it can in the environment. And yes, there are various aspects where things can be improved in these projects from an implementation and execution point of view. But having said that, given where things were 15-20 years back, India has come a long way, and today there are many successful projects which have been implemented, albeit with delays and other costs, but still they are getting implemented. So the government is aware of that. It is making some steps to improve that. But the fact is that the private sector will continue to and has to continue to take that risk in these sectors. And it is also an opportunity for private sector to earn revenues and make money in these sectors.
Sure, but my reading is still a little bit different, Prashant. I do listen and hear your message that the government has become much more conscious of performance. But I also received another message at the same time that the government has become much more conscious of generating revenues through these public-private partnership projects. And at this juncture, I'm perplexed to try and situate the role of the government. Is it primarily to generate revenues through these projects? Is it just performance? Doesn't the government have a much larger role in terms of its societal accountabilities?
See, I think the thinking also has changed, because if the private sector is going to make money in these projects, then the question is, why should only the private sector make money? Doesn't the government have an equal opportunity and responsibility to make money? And like I said, that when these projects were conceptualized, it was the social interest aspect which was relevant in these projects. But today, these projects take into account both the social and economic interest. The government, is not averse to making money. And if that money comes without taking any risk or transferring risk to the private sector, well be it. The government has implemented this, in various projects where it takes different types of risk. It is not like it doesn't take any risk, it takes some risk. It runs a transparent tendering process, but it also prices that risk. It allows the private sector also to price that risk. So I think there is an upside here, there is a learning here. And also the government honestly may not have the technology, the R&D, the kind of standards and expertise required to manage so many sectors in a way which public wants. So it is best left to the private sector to bring in that technology. If you look at today the airport sector, we have world class airports in India. They win a number of awards. The standards are sort of world class and as compared to any other airports in the world. And this is something which the government has got the private sector to do, invest in, and turn around these airports. So it could still have done it on its own, but if the private sector can do it and still the government makes money, then why should it not?
I hear you that there are several world-class airports that have been commissioned, but at the same time, these projects don't come at they come at the cost of societal risk, right? So Navi Mumbai Airport, which is being commissioned soon, has seen about 10 villages that have got displaced, and civil society organizations have made quite a lot of efforts to bring some of these disadvantages and disadvantageous trade-offs in public domain for a larger discourse, but somehow the opacity of public-private partnerships doesn't allow this discourse to become much more mainstream. And I think there's an intrinsic problem there, because public-private partnerships is essentially, when I hear you, what I gather is that it has induced market-led thinking, which has become so intrinsic to public sector thinking today that it becomes a critical question to see to what extent this market-led thinking is actually working in public interest. And so there's a deeper ideological question there. I think that the government as well as the private sector organizations need to deal with. So your thoughts on some learnings there would be nice to have and would be important to have.
Yeah, no, I agree completely, Champaka, that I think that there should be greater participation for civil society in these projects. Today, I think what is happening is that the fact is that it is the private sector which has access to data, which has access to government officials, which get to
Absolutely.
implement these projects. You and I, as a common citizen, will not have access to a tender unless we pay for it. Will not have access to participate in a public process unless we are part of an organization which has a say in it. So I think the challenge is that civil society needs to be more included, and these projects need to be sort of more inclusive in their outreach. And where I would say that India still has an advantage of public interest and public interest litigation, which has evolved over many years, which recognizes the role of civil society in some of these projects. To give an example, the recent example where Sterlite's factory in Tamil Nadu was stopped from manufacturing, it was asked to shut down. There are examples of the POSCO litigation in Orissa. They were sent back. Starting from the MC Mehta days till today, public element is there, but the public element, I think the challenge is by the time public element reaches the doors of government and courts, it is a huge challenge, which is faced by civil society to get to that point. It involves a lot of money, lot of resources, lot of time. It is very difficult for civil society to do it every time. But I think also, the fact is that the government somewhere has to take into account the role of that civil society will play. And somewhere I think it is the fact that even if you take our steel flyover project in Bangalore, which faced public scrutiny, the government is also aware that tomorrow, given the public nature of these projects, it is open to challenges before a court of law, and the government has to defend it before a court of law. So in one sense, whilst there is, I would agree that there is opacity in terms of granting these projects and participation in these projects at the time of tendering. In another way, because access to courts also is now open to all, and there is it is a little more, I would say, vigilant and robust. Civil society is able to participate more freely. I think the government also is aware that its decisions will be subject to scrutiny. It is answerable to the public as well as courts. It needs to defend its decisions before courts, and therefore has to sort of do something which takes into account civil society's interests. So whilst it's not ideal, I mean ideally the participation should be more in these projects, and from the beginning itself, from conceptualization itself, which doesn't happen. But at the same time, I think somewhere there is a role for civil society to play in these projects, and at least before sort of courts of law, where they can be heard and sort of present their point of views.
Most certainly, these projects, in terms of their institutional arrangements, need to be opened up and managed through a more democratically led process. Special purpose vehicles, independent regulatory authorities, which are currently functioning rather within ring-fenced domains of governance and decision making. absolutely need to open up to public scrutiny and, of course, as you rightly mentioned, scrutiny of the courts as well. This has been such an important discussion, Prashant, given that the transactions of the private sector with the public sector, as you rightly mentioned, typically remains hidden behind a veil. Also, that these technical and financial matters often seem too complex and exclusive, right, to be discussed in simple ways. So this has been very valuable. Your book is certainly going to stay with me as a companion for long, given my own research interests as well. I'm sure this exhaustive coverage of several sectors that you've covered in your book will inspire several practitioners, businessmen and women, and researchers to penetrate this challenging field. Thank you, Prashant. Such a pleasure to have this conversation.
Thank you, Champaka. Once again, thank you to BIC. It's been wonderful sharing some thoughts, challenges that is present in this sector. The sort of book is just one step in this direction. For for those who are interested, it's available on Amazon India's site. But that apart, this sector is complicated, and sort of India's journey has been fascinating. Been so many ups and downs, but I'm hopeful that going forward, as the learnings grow, we'll make less mistakes, and sort of from I think just a public interest point of view, these projects will be hugely beneficial for one and all. Thank you.
Thank you for hanging in there and listening to the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, do share it with friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew behind this podcast is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Episode artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org. This is Lekha Naidu, signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.